Chapter 1. Like Angels Were Pushing. May 22, 1943. A Bavarian airfield. Adolf Galland strapped himself into the cockpit of something that shouldn't exist. Around him, engineers and test pilots stood watching, arms crossed, waiting to see what the general of fighters would make of their machine. Most of them had their doubts. The aircraft looked strange. Swept wings, twin-engine nacelles slung underneath like bombs a nose wheel instead of the conventional tail wheel setup. Everything about it screamed complexity. Complexity meant problems. Problems meant delays. Galland had been fighting since the Spanish Civil War. He'd flown combat missions over Poland, France, and Britain. He'd shot down 104 enemy aircraft and survived when most of his contemporaries were dead. He knew fighters the way a master craftsman knows his tools. And when he pressed the starter button and the Junkers UMO 004 engines began their distinctive howling spool-up, he knew immediately that everything had changed. The Me-262 accelerated down the runway, unlike anything he'd flown before. No propeller torque, no vibration, just smooth, relentless acceleration. The nose wheel lifted cleanly, something the test pilots had worked months to get right, and suddenly he was airborne, climbing through 600 kilometers per hour like it was nothing. Up at altitude, Galland pushed the throttles forward. The jet responded instantly, surging ahead with a power that felt almost supernatural. He pulled into a turn, testing the controls. Crisp, responsive. He leveled out and checked the airspeed indicator again. It was climbing past numbers he'd never seen in level flight, 700 kilometers per hour. Then more. When he landed and climbed out of the cockpit, the waiting engineers saw something rare on the face of the hardened combat veteran. Wonder. It felt like angels were pushing. Galland told them. He immediately wrote to Hermann Göring's production chief. The words he chose weren't measured or diplomatic. They were urgent. The aircraft is a great hit. It will guarantee us an enormous advantage in operations while the enemy adheres to the piston engine. This aircraft opens up completely new tactical possibilities. But what Galland didn't know, what none of them fully understood, yet was that those tactical possibilities would arrive far too late to matter. The seeds of delay had already been planted, and they were about to strangle the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. Chapter 2. The Long Road to Jet Power. The story had begun years earlier in 1939 when Messerschmitt started work on what they called Project 1065. The concept was ambitious, a fighter powered entirely by jet engines, a technology so new that most of the aviation establishment thought it was a waste of time. Ernst Heinkel had already demonstrated jet flight with his He-128 in 1939, proving the basic concept worked. But proving something in a test flight and building a practical combat aircraft were entirely different challenges. The Me-262 would need reliable engines, sufficient range, heavy armament, and handling characteristics that wouldn't kill inexperienced pilots. Each of these requirements presented enormous technical obstacles. The biggest problem was the engines themselves. Two competing designs emerged, the BMW 003 and the Junkers UMO 004. Both were revolutionary axial flow turbojets completely different from anything that had come before, and both suffered from the same fundamental issue: nobody knew how to build them properly yet. The materials were wrong. Turbine blades needed to withstand temperatures and stresses that would destroy conventional metals. The Germans didn't have access to the specialized alloys. required nickel, cobalt, molybdenum were all in critically short supply needed for conventional weapons production. Engineers had to improvise using mild steel components with aluminum coatings. It was a compromise that would haunt the aircraft for its entire operational life. The first Me 262 prototype flew in April 1941, but it needed a conventional Junkers Jumo 210 piston engine mounted in the nose just to get airborne because the jet engines weren't ready. When they finally tried flying it with just the BMW 003 jets in November 1941, both engines failed in flight. The pilot had to restart the piston engine and limp home. It wasn't until July 18, 1942, that the Me 262 finally flew under pure jet power, using the Jumo 004 engines. Even then, problems persisted. The engines overheated, turbine blades crept and deformed under thermal stress, compressors stalled if the pilot moved the throttle too quickly. Fuel pumps failed. The whole system was temperamental and fragile. And then there was Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarschall head of the Luftwaffe and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, looked at the jet program and saw something he didn't understand. Why divert scarce resources to an experimental aircraft when conventional fighters like the Bf-109 were doing the job? In February 1940, he cut the jet engine development team down to just 35 engineers, 35 people to revolutionize aviation. The program languished. Months turned into years. By the time people in power realized what they had, the war had turned against Germany, and time was running out. Chapter 3. The Führer's Obsession. Hitler saw the Me 262 for the first time in November 1943 at Insterburg Aviation Center. By then, the Eastern Front was collapsing. The Allies were preparing to invade France. German cities were being pounded day and night by Allied bombers. The strategic situation was desperate. Göring stood beside Hitler as they watched the sleek jet taxi past. The Führer's eyes followed the aircraft with obvious interest. "Can it carry bombs?" Hitler asked. Göring, eager to please, as always, assured him it could. 500 kilograms, possibly 1,000 in the future. Hitler's expression changed. This aircraft must be produced as a bomber, a fast bomber that can strike the invasion beaches. The engineers and Luftwaffe officers exchanged glances. They'd assumed Hitler understood this was a defensive interceptor designed to climb quickly and attack Allied bomber formations. Using it as a bomber made no tactical sense. The bomb load would be tiny. The pilot sat over the wings with virtually no visibility of ground targets. At the speeds the Me 262 flew, accurate bombing would be nearly impossible. But nobody contradicted the Führer. Not directly. For months, they worked around his orders, continuing to develop the Me 262 as a fighter while paying lip service to the bomber concept. They thought Hitler would eventually see reason or forget about it. They were wrong. In May 1944, during a conference on various emergency programs, Hitler brought up the Me 262 again. How many were capable of carrying bombs, he asked. Erhard Milch, who'd been overseeing much of the aircraft production, made a fatal mistake. "None, my Führer. The Me 262 is being built exclusively as a fighter aircraft." Hitler erupted. Witnesses later said they'd rarely seen him in such a rage. He accused Milch, Göring and the entire Luftwaffe leadership of disobedience, unreliability, and outright treachery. Everyone had spent 6 months assuming the Me 262 would be a fighter-bomber when Hitler had explicitly ordered otherwise. On May 27, 1944, Hitler issued a decree that couldn't be ignored or worked around. The Me-262 could only be produced and used as a bomber, not a fighter bomber, a pure bomber. Anyone who violated this order would face severe consequences. This single decision cost Germany 6 months of fighter production at the exact moment when those fighters were desperately needed. The Me-262's rolling off assembly lines in the summer and fall of 1944 were immediately assigned to bomber units forced to carry ordnance that compromised their performance, sent on missions they weren't designed for. American bombers continued to obliterate German industry. Allied fighters continued to massacre the Luftwaffe, and the one aircraft that might have made a difference sat on the ground, waiting for Hitler to change his mind. It wouldn't be until November 1944, after persistent efforts by Albert Speer and others, that Hitler finally relented and allowed the Me-262 to be produced as a fighter. By then, it was far too late. Chapter 4. Too fast to catch, too fragile to last. When the Me-262 finally did enter combat as a fighter in late 1944, Allied pilots were shocked. The first confirmed encounter happened on July 26, 1944, when a Me-262 attacked a British Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft over Bavaria. The Mosquito pilot later reported that something had flashed past him impossibly fast-fired and was gone before he could react. His aircraft was damaged, but he managed to limp back to Italy and land. Allied intelligence had known about German jet development, but knowing something exists and facing it in combat are different experiences. The Me-262 was genuinely revolutionary. Top speed over 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than the best Spitfires and Mustangs. Rate of climb that made it nearly untouchable. And firepower that was absolutely devastating. 4 30mm Mk-108 cannons in the nose, each capable of firing 650 rounds per minute. A single burst from those cannons could tear a B-17 bomber apart. Later versions carried R-4M unguided rockets, 24 of them mounted under the wings. A salvo from those rockets could break up an entire bomber formation, fired from beyond the range of defensive fire. When things went right, the Me-262 was virtually unstoppable. On March 18, 1945, 37 jets from Jagdgeschwader 7 intercepted a massive formation of 221 American bombers protected by 632 escort fighters. The jets tore through the formation, shooting down 12 bombers, and a fighter then escaped with only 3 losses of their own. But things rarely went right. The Jumo 004 engines built from substandard materials under wartime conditions were unreliable in ways that proved fatal. The official service life was 25 hours before a complete overhaul. In practice, many engines failed far sooner, 10 hours, sometimes less. Turbine blades would creep and deform from the heat. The compressor would stall if the throttle was moved too abruptly. Foreign object debris could destroy the engine in seconds. Pilots reported that at least one engine could be expected to fail on almost every sortie. Flying on a single engine, the Me-262 lost its speed advantage. It couldn't outrun Mustangs or Thunderbolts. It became just another target. The landing gear was weak and prone to collapse, especially on rough airfields. By 1945, Germany's infrastructure was crumbling under Allied bombing, and Me-262s were often operating from damaged runways or even stretches of Autobahn. Every landing was a gamble. Training was inadequate. By late 1944, Germany had plenty of aircraft, but not enough experienced pilots or fuel to train replacements properly. Young pilots with minimal experience were thrown into jet fighters that required careful handling. A report from November 1944 found that out of 30 Me-262s delivered to one unit, there had been 26 losses in a matter of weeks. 8 were combat losses. 7 crashed during normal takeoff or landing. 6 ran out of fuel. 3 crashed during emergency procedures. 2 collided with each other. Half of all losses were due to pilot error. And then there was the vulnerability during takeoff and landing. The jet engines needed time to spool up to full power. During those critical moments when the Me-262 was slow and climbing, it was desperately vulnerable. Allied pilots quickly learned to patrol above. Me-262 airfields waiting. Chuck Yeager, who would later become the first person to break the sound barrier, shot down his first Me-262 by catching it during its landing approach. Lieutenant Urban Drew shot down 2 on the same day as they were taking off. The 55th Fighter Group once surprised an entire squadron of Me-262s on the runway and destroyed 6 before they could even get airborne. The Luftwaffe tried to counter with FW-190s flying top cover with massive anti-aircraft batteries, flak alleys, protecting the approach corridors. But there were never enough conventional fighters, never enough ammunition. Germany was losing the war of attrition. Chapter 5. Galland's Last Stand. In January 1945, Adolf Galland was dismissed from his position as General of Fighters. He'd been too vocal in his criticism of Göring, too insistent that the Luftwaffe's leadership was incompetent. The final straw came when he arranged a meeting where other fighter commanders openly complained about the high command. The Gestapo opened a file on him. Heinrich Himmler wanted him tried for treason. Instead, Galland was given one last chance. Form an experimental jet unit, prove what the Me-262 could do when flown by the best pilots Germany had left. He called it Jagdverband 44, JV-44, a squadron-sized unit that would become legend. Galland recruited the cream of the Luftwaffe pilots with hundreds of kills holders of the Knight's Cross and higher decorations men whose names were famous throughout Germany. Many of them were supposed to be flying other missions or had been grounded due to injuries. They came anyway. This was their last chance to fly the aircraft they'd waited so long for to prove what could have been. The first Me-262s arrived at their airfield near Munich in sections on railway trucks. Mechanics worked around the clock to assemble them, while Allied bombers hammered German positions all around. By March 1945, they were operational. For 6 weeks, JV-44 fought against overwhelming odds. They flew missions against American bomber streams attacking formations that blackened the sky. Sometimes they scored spectacular victories. Galland himself shot down an American bomber on his first jet combat mission. The unit racked up dozens of kills. But the losses were constant. Fuel shortages meant they couldn't fly as often as they needed. When they did fly, there were always problems, engine failures, landing. Gear collapses being bounced by American fighters during vulnerable moments. On April 26, 1945, Galland himself was shot down by a P-47 Thunderbolt. His Me-262 was riddled with bullets, his knee shattered. He managed to crash land near his base, but his fighting days were over. A few days later, American ground forces overran JV-44's airfield. They found the remaining Me-262s lined up out of fuel, unable to fly. The war was ending. The jet age had arrived, but for Nazi Germany, it had arrived too late to matter. Chapter 6. The Revolution. that came too late. In the end, Germany produced around 1 to 400 Me 262s. Only about 300 ever saw combat. There were never more than a few dozen operational at any one time. Against the thousands of Allied aircraft filling the skies over Europe, they were a drop in the ocean. German pilots claimed 542 Allied aircraft destroyed by Me 262s. Even if that number is accurate and wartime claims were often exaggerated, it represented a fraction of Allied losses. The United States alone was producing thousands of aircraft per month. The British were doing the same. One Me 262 might shoot down 5 or 6 Allied planes before being destroyed or grounded by mechanical failure, but 5 more Allied planes would arrive the next day. The numbers were never in Germany's favor. Could the Me 262 have changed the outcome of the war if it had arrived earlier? It's tempting to speculate. If Hitler hadn't delayed the program with his bomber obsession, if the engines had been more reliable, if production had started a year earlier, maybe the air war over Germany would have gone differently. But the reality is more complex. Even without Hitler's interference, the engine problems would have delayed the Me 262. The Jumo 04 simply wasn't ready for mass production until mid-1944. The materials shortages would have remained, the lack of fuel would have grounded the jets regardless, and by 1944, Germany was already losing on every front. One weapons system, however advanced, couldn't reverse that tide. What the Me 262 did accomplish was to prove beyond any doubt that the future of aviation belonged to jets. Every major air force took notice. The Americans captured several Me 262s and studied them intensively. British engineers examined every detail of the Jumo engines. Soviet forces seized German jet technology, and German engineers using both to jumpstart their own jet programs. The North American F-86 Sabre, the fighter that would dominate the skies over Korea just 5 years later, incorporated swept wings and design principles learned directly from the Me 262. The Soviet MiG-15 used copied German jet engine technology. British jets like the Gloucester Meteor benefited from lessons learned studying the Me 262's successes and failures. In a very real sense, the Me 262 shaped the post-war world of military aviation. Its influence echoed through decades of fighter development. For the pilots who flew it, the Me 262 represented something else, a glimpse of what could have been. When Adolf Galland wrote his memoirs after the war, he calculated that if Germany had been able to field just 300 Me 262s in early 1944, properly supported with fuel and maintenance, they could have inflicted losses severe enough to force the Allies to reconsider their daylight bombing campaign. 300 jets. That's all it would have taken to fundamentally alter the air war. Germany built 400 but never had 300 operational at once, not because they couldn't build them, but because of bureaucratic incompetence, material shortages, training deficiencies, and catastrophically bad decisions at the highest levels of command. In one of history's bitter ironies, Germany possessed the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world, but lacked everything else needed to make it effective: competent leadership, adequate resources, sufficient fuel-trained pilots, and above all, time. The engineers who designed the Me 262 weren't laughing at their creation. They knew it worked. They knew it was revolutionary. What broke their hearts was watching it arrive too late in too few numbers, with too many problems that could have been solved if anyone in power had listened earlier. As Allied forces advanced into Germany in the spring of 1945, they found Me-262s everywhere, sitting on airfields, hidden in forests, tucked into tunnels and caves. Beautiful, deadly machines that represented the future of aviation. And every single one of them was grounded out of fuel, waiting for engines that would never arrive, flown by pilots who were dead or captured. The future had arrived, but the Third Reich had run out of tomorrows.